Three identical boys vanished beneath the wide branches of the dying elm tree. One moment they were laughing in the front yard. The next, the street was silent. No tire marks, no broken fence, not even a footprint on the soft earth. The house stood still after that. Neighbors moved away. The windows stayed dark. For 30 years, the place kept its secrets. No answers, no bodies. Just a memory sealed behind the walls until last night when the lights flickered on by themselves and someone heard children's voices in the attic. Voices no one had heard since 1982. Before we step deeper into the mystery, hit subscribe or bookmark this story. You won't want to miss what's waiting inside the house on Broken Elm Street. The early June sun poured golden light over the cracked sidewalks of Broken Elm Street. Heat shimmered above the pavement, bending the edges of reality just enough to make the street feel both forgotten and quietly watching. Number 214 sat at the very end of the Coldique. Its shuttered windows and chipped paint, giving it the tired look of a home that had not been spoken to in a very long time. Ben Ramirez wiped sweat from his brow with the edge of his shirt and pushed the crowbar further into the corner of the garage wall. The plywood was warped with age and brittle too. The touch, but behind it, behind the drywall, something felt off. Why is there framing where it shouldn't be? He muttered, more to himself than to his wife, who was sorting boxers in the driveway. Leah Ramirez looked up from an old crate of dusty garden tools. What? This whole section of the garage? It's weird. Like someone deliberately boxed off a section and didn't finish the framing. She walked over, hands on her hips. Are you saying we're about to find hidden treasure, or a family of raccoons? Ben grinned, though it was cautious. Let's hope it's not the latter. With a satisfying crack, the crowbar pried loose a large piece of drywall, revealing a hollow space behind. Dust swirled in the shaft of sunlight beaming through the small garage window, and then they saw it. A wooden crate wedged between the studs and the old concrete slab, sealed in a space barely 3 feet deep. Time had turned the wood gray and the iron hinges a deep, brittle red. A child's name was scribbled across the top in faded permanent marker. Danny Leia's breath caught. What the hell? Ben knelt, brushing away cobwebs. This doesn't feel right. The crate wasn't locked, just sealed shut with old nails that had long since loosened. With slow fingers, Ben lifted the lid. Inside, the dust clung like ash to objects that should not have been there. Not in a boarded-up corner of a garage, not left like this, not forgotten. A toy parade truck, its wheels missing. A tangle of a laminated school library card with Evan Cooper written in blocky handwriting. A red and blue spiral notebook filled with backward letters and stick figures, and at the bottom, a faded Polaroid. Leia lifted the photograph carefully, as if it might disintegrate. Oh my God. 3 boys, identical in appearance, smiled at the camera in matching red jackets. Their arms were around each other. Behind them, unmistakably, was this very house. Its porch rail still crooked. The same siding, the same cracked sidewalk leading up to the front steps. She turned the photo over. No date, no names. Ben stood slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans. Triplets, I think so. They exchanged a long look. Something cold crept between them, despite the heat outside. Leia stepped outside the garage, the Polaroid still in her hand. She pulled out her phone and searched. Triplets missing Broken Elm Street. It didn't take long. Missing persons. 1,989. Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper, age 7. Last seen riding their bikes home from school in Rosewood County, Texas. There were photos, There were their faces. Ben appeared beside her, reading over her shoulder. They disappeared from this street. Leia nodded slowly. I think they lived right across the road. They turned together, gazing across the quiet, tree-lined street. A modest brick home stood directly opposite their driveway, its lawn slightly overgrown, its porch shaded by a creaking awning. Wind brushed through the trees, lifting dry leaves along the sidewalk like whispered memories. The house looked still. Ben broke the silence first. We need to report this. Of course, Leia said, but her voice had changed. There was something tender in it now, a softness shaped like sadness. She looked back at the photo again, those little boys smiling, oblivious, still alive in that single, captured second, frozen in a moment someone had desperately hidden. The police arrived by late afternoon. 2 cruisers, 1 detective in an ill-fitting blazer. They took photos of the items, bagged everything with plastic gloves, and asked questions in clipped procedural tones. This case is cold as the Arctic, one officer murmured as he zipped a plastic evidence bag shut. Been closed since '94? No. Leads in over 20 years? Detective Kwan was polite, efficient, and entirely uninterested in speculation. We'll log the evidence, reopen the file, and follow up if anything new comes up, she said, handing Leia a card. But don't expect a miracle. These boys have been missing for 35 years. Ben nodded respectfully, but Leia lingered behind. She stared at the wall, the space where the crate had sat, hidden behind insulation and studs. Who put it there? Why these things? Why this house? After the officers left, Ben began sealing up the wall again. Leia didn't help. She just stood in the driveway, staring across the street. The porch light flicked on at the brick house across the road. A figure sat quietly in a rocking chair. She hadn't noticed him before. That evening, as twilight melted into soft orange along the rooftops, Leia pulled up the missing persons article again. She read every word, every paragraph. She learned their names: Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper, 7 years old. Last seen near the corner of Broken Elm Street and Willow Lane at 4:12 p.m. A neighbor said they were riding bikes and laughing. Another claimed they never came home from school at all. The case was labeled non-suspicious disappearance, then later escalated to suspected abduction. Their mother had been quoted in a newspaper from 1990. She was still in town. She had never moved. I just want someone to remember their faces, she said. They didn't just disappear. Someone made them disappear. Leia closed her laptop. The photo sat beside her on the nightstand. In it, the middle boy, Evan, had a gap between his front teeth. Miles had grass-stained jeans. Danny in the middle held a bent stick like a sword. They looked alive, and now they were ghosts in their garage. The next morning, Leia walked across the street. The woman who answered the door was older than in the photos, of course. Her hair had gone white at the temples, but her eyes were the same, sharp, observant, gentle, in a way that comes only from heartbreak so deep it folds in on itself. Yes, she said, peering through the screen door. Ella Cooper, Leia asked. The woman hesitated, then nodded. My name is Leia Ramirez. My husband and I just bought the house across the street. Elaine's expression didn't change. We were doing some renovations, Leia continued, her voice catching. And we found something, some things. A crate behind the wall in the garage. Still, Elaine didn't speak. There were children's items inside, Leia said. And a photograph of 3 "Boys?" Now Elaine opened the screen door. "You should come in," she said quietly. The living room was dim but clean. A fan spun slowly overhead. Floral wallpaper peeled slightly in one corner. On the mantel sat 3 identical silver frames, one for each son. Each held the same school portrait, a round face, dark eyes, identical toothy grins. Time had not been kind to the prince. The colors had faded, but not the faces. Elaine sat down across from Leia, her hands folded in her lap. "May I see it?" she asked. Leia reached into her bag and pulled out the Polaroid. Elaine took it with steady hands. Her face didn't change at first, just a long silence that seemed to stretch the length of the room. Her eyes scanned the photo. Over and over again, as though the boys might say something new if she just stared long enough. "This was the day before," she whispered. "That's Miles in the front. He always stood like that. And Daniel," her voice caught, but she continued. "He picked out those jackets. They said red was their superhero color." She brushed her thumb across the edge of the photo like it might warm under her touch. "I had this exact picture. I thought it was lost. It was behind a wall," Leia said gently, "in a crate with some of their things." Elaine looked up. "In that house?" Leia nodded. Elaine closed her eyes. "For years, I used to walk past that house trying to remember who lived there. I never thought to check it after Vernon Hale died." "Vernon Hale," Leia echoed. "He was the man who lived there back then. Older gentleman, kept to himself mostly. Lost his wife before we moved in." Leia felt her pulse quicken. "Was he ever investigated?" "No," Elaine said quietly. "He had an alibi, and he was respected." She stared again at the photo. "But I always wondered. He had this dog, Brutus. My boys loved that dog. Sometimes I'd see them petting it on the sidewalk, even though I warned them not to talk to strangers." She looked up sharply with a kind of calm clarity that sent chills through Leia's spine. "Mrs. Ramirez, that wall was sealed deliberately. Those items were not forgotten. They were hidden." Elaine Cooper did not sleep that night. Had left the photograph on her bedside table, face up, staring into the ceiling. Her hand kept drifting toward it through the dark, her fingers grazing its edges like it was an ember she could reignite with touch alone. The boys' smiles haunted her in a way they hadn't in years. Not because they were gone, but because for the first time in 3 decades, she no longer felt so certain they were. Gone, that is. At 3:17 a.m., she stepped outside barefoot into the garden behind her home. She'd stopped planting years ago after the roses failed to bloom on what would have been the boy's 10th birthday. Now it was mostly weeds, and the stubborn remains of lies that refused to die no matter how long she ignored them. She knelt in the dirt and placed a photograph beside her. "I told everyone," she whispered. "They weren't just lost." The wind rustled the fence. A dog barked faintly in the distance. Elaine stood and for the first time in 15 years began to pull weeds from the earth. By mid-mean morning, Leia and Ben returned to number 214, still overwhelmed by what had been found. The house felt different now, heavier. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes seemed like whispers left behind by people who were never supposed to be forgotten. They sat in the dining room with coffee mugs, neither of them touched. "We have to help her," Leia said quietly. Ben exhaled. "I just don't know how. We gave everything to the police. What else can we do?" "We can't pretend we didn't find that," she said, gesturing toward the garage with her eyes. "You saw her face. That photo was taken here. There's something about this house that no one ever looked hard enough at." Ben rubbed his hands over his jaw. "I mean, we could look up Vernon Hale. Figure out who he was, what happened to him. I already did, Leia said. She turned her laptop around. Died in 2002. Stroke, no children. There's not much on him, but I found his will. Ben raised an eyebrow. His will. She nodded. Filed at the Rosewood County Courthouse. It's public record. He left the house to a niece, someone named Mary Lucklin. She sold it 5 years later to a rental company, which then left it vacant until we bought it. So Mary Lucklin might know something. She's not in Texas anymore, Leia said. Moved to Maine in 2008, but I'm going to call her. Ben looked at her. Are we sure we should be the ones doing this? I mean, this is the police's job, isn't it? They had the job 35 years ago and they didn't find anything, Leia said sharper than she meant to. If it were our kids, Ben held up a hand. Okay, you're right. Outside, clouds began to gather over the street, dimming the morning sun into a flat gray. Elaine returned to the Ramirez house that afternoon, her fingers stained with dirt, the photograph still clutched in one hand. She knocked once and waited. Her composure was back, calm, watchful, almost regal in its restraint. But Leia noticed how tightly she gripped the photo. Come in, Leia said, stepping aside. Lane's eyes moved over the house as she entered. The walls, the lighting, the hallway. It was muscle memory, watching for details. She had spent so long imagining this space. Was anything else found? Elaine asked softly. Just the box, Leia said. Some toys, school papers, and the room itself. It was sealed. Ben nodded. 2x4 south and drywall layered in. Nothing fancy, but deliberate. Elaine looked around again. Did he have a dog? She asked. Ben blinked. What? Vernon Hale. Did you find evidence? Of a dog. Chew marks, claw scratches, dog bowls, anything. No, Leia said, frowning. Why? Elaine turned toward the front window and pulled aside the curtain slightly, staring out at the yard. My boys loved his dog, she murmured. A big retriever. They'd pet it on their way home from school, talk to it through the fence. I used to warn them about strangers, but a dog like that, it lowers your guard. You think the dog was used to lure? Them, Leia asked. Elaine didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. I think it started with the dog, then with kindness, then with trust. That evening, Leia placed a call to the Rosewood County Records Office and asked for a copy of Vernon Hale's property plans. She was surprised when the clerk said, That's funny. You're not the first person to ask for those. Someone came by last year. Do you remember who? The clerk paused. No name, just some guy. Wanted blueprints of the garage for a restoration project? Paid cash for the printouts. Leia scribbled a note. Is there any record of who Hale's caregivers were before he died? She asked. Probably under his medical records. I'd have to check if that's publicly accessible. Leia hung up with more questions than answers. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Ben was asleep, she sat on the living room floor with a flashlight and examined every inch of the remaining garage wall. At the baseboard behind the shelving, she found something small, a scuff mark. Pale gray against the wood, almost gone with time. She leaned closer. It wasn't a scuff. It was a name scratched in with a nail or sharp object. Evan Elaine stood in her kitchen early the next morning, steeping tea in a chipped mug. The garden was behind her where the soil had been freshly turned for the first time in decades. She still hadn't planted anything, but she intended to. For the first time in years, she intended something. The knock on her door was soft. She opened. It to find Detective Sarah Nolan standing there. Her blazer wrinkled from the morning humidity, her eyes cautious but kind. "Mrs. Cooper," she said, "I'd like to talk." Elaine held the door open. They sat at the kitchen table. Tea for one, silence for both. "I saw the photos," Nolan said, "and the evidence from the Ramirez house, the boys' belongings, the Polaroid, and now new markings found in the wall." Elaine raised her eyebrows. "So, you believe me now?" Nolan sighed. "I believe something happened in that house." "What exactly?" "I don't know yet." Elaine folded her hands. "Vernon Hale. He wasn't just some grieving old man. There's more. We've reopened the case," Nolan said unofficially. "Cold cases don't always get much attention, but there's enough here to justify a search warrant for the property." "I already searched it," Elaine said quietly. 4 years in my head, over and over." Nolan looked down at her notes. "You said the boys were last seen on their bikes. Were those ever recovered?" Elaine's eyes hardened. "Number." "The bikes disappeared with them." Nolan nodded slowly. "Then I want to dig beneath the garage under the foundation if necessary." Elaine blinked. "Why?" "Because in 2001, Nolan said, a similar disappearance happened 2 towns over. Another old man, another child, never found. That man also died of a stroke. And guess what we found in his garage last year?" Elaine leaned forward. A pair of shoes. Children's size, buried in concrete under the water heater. The following day, construction permits were fast-tracked. Nolan brought in a forensic unit under the guise of structural inspection. The Ramirez couple agreed to allow the dig. A slab of concrete was removed near the back corner of the garage. They found nothing at first. Then, just beneath the dirt, buried in plastic wrap and old cloth, they found a crumpled lunchbox, red metal, rusted. Inside, a pair of socks, a Pokémon sticker, a folded note that read, "Please don't tell Mom I took the dog treats." Evan Elaine sat on the steps of the house, holding the lunchbox in both hands, like it was a living thing. The sun was setting behind her, bleeding gold through the trees of Broken Elm Street. For the first time in 35 years, the street felt like it might breathe again. Elaine stood at the edge of the Ramirez garage, the earth still torn where the forensic crew had left off. The outline of the foundation cracked and incomplete. In her gloved hands, she held the lunchbox again, lighter than she remembered, as if memory had added weight to it over time. It had been red once, foray truck red, Daniel's favorite. She remembered Evan begging for the same one at the store, just so he could match. But this one, she was sure, had belonged to Miles. He was always the quiet one, the one who didn't fight to be seen, but who left notes everywhere. She turned it slowly in her hands. It smelled like rust, dust, and old. Apis Leia stood nearby, watching her carefully. "Do you want to sit?" she asked softly. Elaine shook her head. "If I sit, I might fall apart." Later that afternoon, Detective Nolan returned with 2 small evidence bags. In one, a faded Pokémon sticker. In the other, the folded note. Elaine stared at it through the plastic. "Please don't tell Mom I took the dog treats." "Evan." It was written in red crayon. The letters were uneven, tilted. Evan had always rushed through things, always scribbled. "It's real," Elaine said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's his." Nolan gave her a minute before speaking. "We're going to bring in a ground-penetrating radar unit, scan the entire yard, under the house, the surrounding areas." Elaine nodded. "You think they're buried?" "I think someone hid something," Nolan said. "And when people hide things, it's because they don't want them found." The next day, Elaine brought a small box from her attic. It was unmarked, tucked between 2 cartons of Christmas ornaments and old tax records. Inside were dozens of photographs, neatly organized by year. The boys' lives captured in film. Birthdays, bike rides, first days of school. 3 nearly identical faces. Yet to her they were always different. She laid them out on her kitchen table. One by one. Daniel, always the one grinning just a little too wide. His hair stuck up no matter what she did. Evan, the talus by a smidge, always with dirt on his knees. Quick to argue, quicker to hug. Miles.com/sweet, the thinker. His favorite thing was reading comic books upside down. She stared at the final photo taken 2 weeks before they disappeared. All 3 of them standing in the driveway, helmets on, bikes ready, grins as wide as Texas. A gust of wind stirred the edge of the photograph. Her eyes narrowed. In the far background, barely visible behind the trees, was the corner of Vernon Hale's house. And next to it, unmistakably, the tall silhouette of Brutus, the golden retriever, and just behind him, half concealed by the front porch post, a man's shape, thin, pale shirt, standing perfectly still. Elaine picked up the photo, heart thutting. She had never noticed it before. Meanwhile, Leah was on the phone with the Rosewood County Clerk's office. Yes, I'm still trying to track down next of kin records for Vernon Hale. Any caregivers? Medical aides? Hospice workers? Anything? She paused as the woman on the other end typed. There's an entry, the clerk said. A man named Ralph Mason, listed as a part-time aide in the final 6 months before Hale's stroke. No formal license on file, which is odd. Leia's pen froze. Do you have an address? Just a P.O. box? It's outdated. Leia scribbled it down anyway. Anything else unusual? She asked. Well, not sure if it matters, but Mr. Hale's death certificate had a discrepancy. He was declared deceased at home by a neighbor, but the coroner noted signs of a prior fall, one that likely happened a few days before the stroke. Was it investigated? Numbral causes were listed. No autopsy was performed. Leia thanked her and hung up. Ralph Mason? She murmured to herself. The name had a hollow sound. That evening, Leia walked across the street again. Elaine answered the door, holding the photo with a blurred background figure. I think this is him, she said without preamble. Vernon and Brutus and maybe someone else. Leia looked closely. That's your boys on the bikes? Elaine nodded. The morning they disappeared. Leia hesitated. I found a name. Ralph Mason. He was Vernon's aide in the month before he died. Eleanie's eyes flicked toward her, dark and wide. Was he investigated? No one mentioned him in the original report. They sat down at Elaine's dining table. Leia spread out the documents she'd collected. Elaine spread out the photos. Piece by piece, they built something. A shape, a pattern, maybe even a truth. The next morning, the GPR team arrived at the Ramirez property. Long, slender equipment swept over the yard, the garage, and the concrete slabs near the foundation. Ben watched from the front steps, arms crossed, tension written in the way he bounced one leg silently against the railing. Detective Nolan stood near the garage entrance, reviewing the scans as they loaded. One of the technicians paused. Ma'am? Nolan stepped forward. What is it? There's a void under the rear corner of the foundation, about 5 feet by 3, unnaturally shaped. It doesn't match any plumbing maps or known construction features. Depth 4 feet down. Could be a crawl space. Could be a sealed pit. Nolan's jaw tightened. Marquette, she said, and get the excavator. Elaine waited on the sidewalk. hands clasped tightly, her garden gloves forgotten in her pockets. The digging took hours. Leah joined her, arms folded, eyes never leaving the work site. At 4:17 p.m., the excavator operator shut off the engine. The crew began to dig by hand. Minutes passed. Then a call rang out. Found something. Everyone rushed forward. A plastic-wrapped bundle. Another 3 in total. But when the bags were opened carefully, respectfully, they didn't contain bodies. They contained bicycles. 3 small rusted children's bikes still intact, still painted in bright colors faded by time, each with a laminated tag tied to the handlebar. Daniel, Evan, Miles. Elaine covered her mouth with both hands. Her knees buckled, and Leah caught her before she could fall. They were here, Elaine whispered. They were here. Detective Nolan knelt beside the bikes, examining the name tags. They buried the bikes, she murmured. But not the boys. That night, Elaine sat on her porch, the photo of her sons clutched in one hand, the red lunchbox beside her. I always said, she whispered, they didn't just disappear. Across the street, the garage light flickered once and went out. She didn't move. The wind stirred the leaves of her overgrown garden, and for the first time in years, it didn't sound like silence. It sounded like breathing, like a house exhaling, like something long buried beginning to rise. It started with Brutus. Elaine hadn't spoken the dog's name in years, not since a faded memory surfaced one sleepless night. A flash of the boys laughing. All 3 huddled around the golden retriever like a secret pact was being made in fur and slobber. Daniel had insisted the dog liked him best, but it was Miles who carried dog treats in his pockets, the good kind, bacon-shipped. They had loved that dog more than anything on the walk home from school, more perhaps than they feared what their mother had told them. Never follow strangers, not even if they have a dog. The discovery of the bikes was front-page news the next morning. Breakthrough in 1989. Triplet disappearance. Bikes found buried in suburban garage. Elaine didn't bother reading the article. The photos said enough. A blurry shot of the rusted bicycles laid out on a tarp. Their plastic name tags dangling, faded by time, but unmistakable. Even the colors of the bikes had survived. Blue, red, and yellow. Daniel, Evan, and Miles. Ben and Leah tried to stay out of the spotlight. Reporters called their home, knocked on the door, even staked out the driveway, hoping to get a quote, but Leah only ever said one thing. We just want answers for Elaine. Detective Nolan came by early that afternoon. She parked down the street and walked to Elaine's front porch with a notebook in one hand and a photograph in the other. I found this in Vernon Hale's personal items at County Storage, she said, handing it over. Taken about a year before your boys disappeared. That's Brutus, right? Elaine looked down. The dog stared out from the photograph, tongueling, eyes wide. And trusting. He sat obediently next to Hale, who held the leash in one hand and a plastic grocery bag in the other. That's him, Elaine confirmed softly. Same spots on the ears. According to veterinary records, Nolan continued, Brutus was put down the same month your boys vanished. The paperwork said he was aggressive. Elaine's brows furrowed. Aggressive? He never bit anyone before? Correct? No, Elaine said. Never? That's what I thought, Nolan murmured. I think the dog saw something or reacted to something and someone wanted him silenced. Elaine's grip tightened on the photo. They didn't silence my boys, though. Not completely. That night, Leah found herself scrolling through newspaper archives again, looking for anything she may have missed. A name, a thread, A pattern. What she found was a 1990 obituary for Vernon Hale's wife, June Hale, and an odd note buried in the column, preceded in death by her son, Matthew, age 3. Leia sat up straighter. Hale had a son. The article didn't elaborate. No date of the child's death. No cause listed. Just a single line, as if someone didn't want to talk about it. She clicked deeper, digging through county birth and death registries. Matthew Hale, born 1957, died 1960. Cause of death, accidental drowning. No further information, but that was the year Hale stopped teaching. Leia wrote the name down and circled it. Elaine returned to the Ramirez house the next morning. Leia met her at the door with coffee and weary eyes. "I found something," she said. They sat at the dining table again, the same place where the Polaroid had first been passed between them. This time, Leia handed her a printed copy of the obituary. Elaine read it twice. "Why would he keep that secret?" she asked. "Why not mention his son?" "Maybe he lost more than just a child that day," Leia said. "Maybe it broke something in him." Elaine traced her finger over the name. "Matthew. Or maybe he wanted another chance," she whispered. Leia looked at her sharply. "You think that's why he took them?" Lane's eyes were steady. 3 boys, all the same age his son would have been, all in one place. He didn't just want a child. He wanted a replacement. Leia swallowed. "Then what happened to them?" Elaine shook her head. "I don't know, but I don't think he acted alone." Detective Nolan's investigation was evolving. She tracked down the hospice records for Hale's final year. Sparse, but just enough to confirm what Leia had found. Ralph Mason had been a caretaker for several elderly patients in the area, but had never filed for a license, and no one seemed to know where he'd come from. Nolan got a break when a bank flagged a dormant safety deposit box registered to Mason. Accessed once in 2003, and then never again. The box was in latch. Nolan got a warrant. Inside the box were the following: a driver's license under the name Harold Moss. Several passports all expired under different names. A single photo. 3 boys sitting on a wooden bench. Their backs were to the camera, but the shape of their heads, the curve of their shoulders, it was them. And the photo was dated July 18th, 1990, 10 months after they vanished. Elaine stared at the photograph for a long time. "I knew it," she said. Ben leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, staring at the photo over her shoulder. "They were alive." Nolan nodded, at least for a while. Leia spoke quietly. "But where were they taken?" "We traced the photo's watermark," Nolan said. "It was printed in Arizona. Small-town lab that's been out of business for decades. It's not much, but it's a lead." Aileen's voice was suddenly firm. "Then I'm going." Nolan hesitated. "It's not safe." "I don't care," Aileen cut in. "If someone out there knows what happened to my boys, I'm not sitting here while you ask questions." "I've sat long enough." There was silence. Then Nolan nodded. "I'll take you." Ben looked at Leia. "What about us?" Leia met Elaine's eyes. "We go too." That evening, Elaine returned home alone. She stood in her bedroom and opened the drawer where she kept the boys' last birthday cards, folded construction paper covered in marker hearts and rocket ships and crooked spelling. She ran her hand over them gently, then reached behind the drawer and pulled out something no one else knew. She kept a lock of hair, 3 actually, one from each of her sons, taped inside an envelope labeled only with the date, March 12th, 1989. She had cut them after a particularly chaotic bath night. The boys had laughed so hard that Miles got soap in his ear and started to cry until Daniel farted in the tub and made everyone laugh again. Elaine smiled at the memory. Then she packed the envelope. If they found something in Arizona, she wanted. DNA ready? Back at number 214, Leia wandered into the garage one more time before bed. She flicked on the light. The patched section of the wall looked no different than the rest now, but she could still feel where the secret had once lived. The bikes, the lunchbox, the name Evan carved into the wood. She walked over and placed her hand on the wall. There was something under the paint she hadn't noticed before. A faint outline like faded crayon. She stepped back and grabbed a flashlight, angled in the right light. The shape came through. It was a crude drawing, a stick figure, then 3 more. A dog beside them and a tall shape behind. Written beneath, and all in shaky letters, "We're not supposed to go." The drive to Arizona was long and mostly quiet. Elaine sat in the back seat, the envelope with the boys' hair samples tucked in her purse, clutched like a lifeline. Detective Nolan drove, eyes steady, always scanning the road like she didn't trust it to stay still. Leia rode shotgun, her notebook on her lap filled with questions. They didn't speak much, only when necessary. Hotel reservations, gas stations, what time the sun would set. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was waiting like a breath not yet released. It was late afternoon when they arrived in Pine Bluff, a withered town near the edge of the Arizona border. Old signs clung to sun-bleached posts and pickup trucks lining the streets outside shuttered diners. The kind of place that had a single gas station and 2 churches across the street from each other. Nolan pulled up to a building with faded paint and a cracked wooden sign. Tanner's Photo Lab. Closed. "This is it," she said. "Where are the boys?" Photo was printed. Elaine opened her door, slowly, as if the ground might shift beneath her. The inside of the shop was dusty, untouched for years. A for-lease sign hung crooked in the front window. Nolan had prearranged access with the property owner who met them there. An older man in work boots and a trucker hat who looked like he hadn't shaved since the photo lab closed. "I used to come in here with my daughter for school photos. He," said Tanner, "was a quiet guy. Nice but odd." "Do you remember him having customers who paid in cash?" Nolan asked. The man nodded. "Pretty much all of them. This was before card readers and square APs. Do you recall anyone printing pictures of kids?" "Around 1990. He thought a moment. "Couldn't say. But there was one guy came in a few times, over a couple years. Always alone. Always with the same old school camera. One of those boxy black ones." "Do you remember what he looked like? Thin, white, tall, beard?" "Some days, clean shaven in others' eyes, like he didn't sleep." "Ralph Mason?" Nolan asked. The man's brow furrowed. "That name sounds right. Why?" Nolan showed him a copy of the passport photo from the safety deposit box. The man nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's him." He didn't say much, but he always had photos of kids. "Said he worked at a camp." "What kind of camp?" "Didn't say, just that he kept them off the streets." Elaine's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Back at the motel that evening, Nolan spread out the evidence on the bed, the boy's photo, the forged IDs, the envelope of DNA samples. "I've contacted a forensics unit nearby," she said. "We're submitting the photo for timeline analysis. In the meantime, there's another lead. A property registered to one of Mason's aliases, Harold Moss, just outside of town." "What kind of property?" Leia asked. "A trailer, Rura. No utilities on file, but someone's been paying the land tax every year in cash." Elaine looked up sharply. We're going. The trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrub brush and rusted fencing. A mailbox stood bent near the gate, the name scratched out with black marker. The place was quiet, not abandoned, but waiting. Nolan stepped out first, hand on her badge. Leia followed, carrying a flashlight. Elaine stayed close, scanning every detail, the tire tracks, the footprints in the dust, the curtain fluttering in the window. They knocked. No answer. Nolan tried the door, unlocked. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated everything. A twin bed with thin sheets, a table, a kettle, a shoebox on the counter, labeled Spring in black ink. Nolan opened it carefully. Inside, photographs, dozens of them, all boys, some older, some younger, some smiling, some blurry. All of them outside on porches, at parks, in fields. Always 3 at a time, but never facing the camera. Leia's voice cracked. Are these them? Elaine stepped forward. She picked up one photo. 3 boys sitting in a circle, backs to the lens, drawing something in the dirt. I know those shoulders, she whispered, even in black and white. Nolan took the box and began to photograph everything. They searched every corner of the trailer, closets, drawers, the old pantry, nothing else except the back room. It had once been a laundry room. The floor had been redone with plywood. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. Something about... It was wrong. Elaine stood at the threshold, unmoving. There's something under us, she said. Leia shined her flashlight at the floor. A faint seam ran through the plywood. Not natural aging. Cottages. Something had been opened here or hidden. They found a crowbar in the tool shed outside. The plywood lifted with effort, revealing a hollow space beneath the floor. Not deep, maybe 3 feet, lined with insulation and old fabric, and in the center, a locked metal box. Nolan pulled it out slowly. The lock was rusted shut, but broke with force. Inside 2 journals tied together with twine, a child's drawing, 3 stick figures and a dog. 1 figure with X's over the eyes, and an envelope labeled Cooper Boys. Elaine opened it. Inside were 3 small bracelets, faded plastic beads, the kind you buy at a dollar store, each with a name spelled in clumsy letters. Daniel, Evan, Miles. Elaine sank to her knees. They kept them, she whispered. They kept their names. That? Night Nolan read through the journals. They weren't written by Vernon Hale. They were Ralph Mason's. The first entry was dated September 22nd, 1989. 2 weeks after the boys vanished. They're settling in, still scared. Especially the youngest, Miles. He hides when I enter the room. Vernon says it will pass, that children need structure. Daniel asks for his mother at night. Further entries described a strict routine, meals, reading, prayer, outdoor time, rewards, and punishments, drawings as therapy, only supervised outdoor play. Evan ran toward the fence today. Vernon slapped him. I told him it was too hard. He said they need fear to stay loyal. The last entry was dated July 19th, 1990. The youngest is gone. Vernon buried him under the shed. I wanted to leave. Vernon said it would be my fault if the others got taken. He said they are his now. Nolan stopped reading. No one spoke. Elaine simply sat at the table staring out the window. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. In the morning, Nolan called the sheriff's office. Excavation at the trailer began within hours. Beneath the shed, they found a shallow grave. Inside, child remains. Male, estimated age 8. DNA tests would confirm it later, but Elaine already knew. It was Miles. Daniel and Evan, however, were nowhere to be found. Elaine stood at the edge of the shallow grave long after the forensics team covered it. The Arizona sun pressed down, hot and unrelenting, but she didn't move. Her hand rested over her chest, her heart hammering beneath her palm. She didn't cry. Not here, not yet. She had cried so much over the years that grief had become an organ. Something that lived in her, always humming quietly in the background. Now it screamed Miles. He had been the smallest, the gentlest. He used to tiptoe around the house early in the morning so he wouldn't wake his brothers. He'd whisper stories. To the dog Plushie, he named Captain Barkley and tuck it into bed like it needed protection. They had failed to protect him. Or maybe, Elaine thought bitterly, they hadn't. She had. Back at the motel, the journals lay spread across the bed, open to passages Nolan and Leia kept rereading. The pages were warped from years of heat and neglect. But Mason's handwriting was sharp, almost obsessive. His thoughts ranged from fragmented to reflective to chillingly clinical. They see me as the helper. I bring food. I explain the rules. But Vernon is the voice they obey. He calls them the brothers, never by name anymore. Says names belong to the past. He keeps them separate now. Says it makes them less likely to plot. Leia flipped a page, her fingers trembling slightly. Miles doesn't eat unless I'm there. He cries without sound. I think he knows it's coming. Evan tried to fight back yesterday. He threw a toy at Vernon. Said, "You're not my dad." Vernon locked him in the dark room for 12 hours. A few entries later, the tone shifted. They're older. Now, Daniel speaks in riddles. Evan stares at me like he knows something I don't. They don't call for help. They haven't in weeks. The silence is worse than the screaming. That evening, Detective Nolan met with the local authorities. Forensics. Confirmed, the remains under the shed were consistent with Miles Cooper based on dental and DNA analysis. The sheriff's department opened a multi-state inquiry for Daniel and Evan, under the assumption they may still be alive or may have been moved before Miles's death. Elaine sat in the motel hallway outside the meeting room, hands clasped tightly. In her lap, her body shook, but her face remained composed. They knew he was gone, she whispered when Nolan returned. Daniel and Evan, they lived with that. For how long? We don't know, Nolan said gently. But the journals end in 1990. The last entry implies Miles died then. That means the other two were alive for nearly a year after the abduction. And after that, Leia asked from the doorway. Nolan hesitated. No trace. Not in Arizona. Not in Texas. Nothing. Elaine shook her head. They're out there. I feel it. Later that night, Elaine found herself sitting alone with the second journal, flipping through the final pages. One entry had been scrolled with such pressure the ink had bled through the page. He took them somewhere, said he needed to start. Again? Said the desert was too exposed. He didn't trust me to follow. He took the Cadillac. Her breath caught. She flipped back to the photos. The same red Cadillac visible in the 1989 photo of the boys in front of Hale's house. The same make model that now sat in a barn back in Rosewood County inside the fenced property Elaine had never been allowed to enter. By morning, Nolan had confirmed the vehicle. Yes, she said. The car is still registered to Vernon Hale's estate. It was never impounded, just left in a storage barn next to the main house. Can we search it? Elaine asked. We already did when we reopened the case, Nolan said. At least the garage, not the barn. We didn't have cause to break the lock. You. Do now, Elaine said, eyes hard. They returned to Broken Elm Street 2 days later. Elaine stood in her garden, the envelope containing the bracelets clutched in her hand. She hadn't stepped into the backyard of Hale's house since the boys disappeared. Not truly. She and Nolan, joined by local authorities, entered the barn together. Dust motes hung in the air like ghost lanterns. The red Cadillac Eldorado sat in the center, a canvas tarp draped lazily across it, faded but intact. Nolan approached slowly, flashlight in one hand. The trunk had been pried open years ago, but no one had looked beneath the lining. Ben, standing nearby with a crowbar, stepped forward at Nolan's signal. He pulled up the lining. A creak, then silence, then the thump of wood against metal. A hidden compartment. Inside, 3 school ID cards partially burned but legible. Daniel Cooper, Evan Cooper, Miles Cooper, and beneath that, a small torn photo. 2 boys, perhaps 11 years old, standing on a beach. One with a dog, one holding. A book, Elaine gasped. It's them, she whispered. The photo was scanned and digitally enhanced. A logo on the boy's t-shirt was traced to a private farm and youth outreach program established in 1992 in rural Texas under a new non-profit name. The founder, Howard Fielding, retired teacher, former colleague of Vernon Hale at Oakage Elementary School. His name had never come up before. Elaine felt her knees buckle when she heard it. I remember him, she said. He taught science. My boys loved him. Nolan read the report aloud. Howard Fielding resigned suddenly in 1990. Claimed early retirement. No transfer of pension. No forwarding address. Leia's voice was low. Do you think he took them? Nolan's face was grim. I think Vernon gave them to someone he trusted. Alan's eyes burned. Then it's time we find him. The nonprofit still existed. The website was minimal, almost rustic. It described a faith-based agricultural community dedicated to helping at-risk youth find purpose through structure and care. It was called Howard's Haven for Hope. No phone number, just an address and a donation link. Elaine stared at the homepage photo. Smiling boys in overalls, shoveling soil. A man in the background, tall, silver-haired, smiling faintly. Can we go? She asked Nolan. We can go, Nolan said. But we don't go alone. The sun hung low over the Texas plains as Elaine Lyer and Detective Nolan approached the gravel drive marked by a faded wooden sign. Howard's Haven for Hope, established 1992. Planting roots, growing lives. The letters had been freshly painted. The gate, however, was old, iron wrought and manual. It creaked as Nolan pushed it open. Elaine's pulse quickened as the car rolled forward. Ben had stayed behind in Rosewood, too shaken to face what might come next. But Elaine needed to be here. Her boys might have walked this same road, might have lived in one of the buildings now silhouetted against the dusty horizon. They passed a pasture where boys, teens mostly, shoveled soil into long rows. From a distance, it looked wholesome, simple, but Elaine had lived long enough to know that even silence could wear a mask. Nolan parked near the main building, a 2-story farmhouse with sun-faded curtains and potted plants on the porch. A woman greeted them at the door, clipboard in hand. Welcome to the Haven. I'm Sister Mara. She was in her 60s, short white hair under a straw sun hat, her voice soft but firm. Are you here for a tour, or we're here to speak with Mr. Fielding? Nolan said, flashing her badge. Is he on site? Sister Mara's smile faltered. I believe so. He was in the greenhouse earlier, but he may have gone back to his residence. Nolan nodded. Please let him know the Rosewood County Police Department has reopened a missing persons case, and we have reason to believe this property is involved." The woman's face palled. I'll find him." The greenhouse was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of damp soil and lemon balm. Elaine stepped inside alone, her gaze sweeping over seedlings, hanging pots, hand-painted signs made by children. At the far end, she saw a man bent over a tray of tomato sprouts, humming a tune, tuneless but gentle. He looked up. Silver hair, a lined face, a soft smile, cautious but not unfriendly. "May I help you?" he asked. Elaine didn't answer at first. Her throat had tightened. His eyes narrowed. "Do I know you?" She stepped forward. "You told my boys?" "At Oak Ridge Elementary." He blinked. His hand went still in the soil. "Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper," she said. "They vanished in 1989. A long pause. "I remember them," he said softly. "Smart boys, gentle, always together." Elaine studied his face. "What happened to them?" He glanced down at the seedlings. "I don't know." She took another step forward. "But Vern and Hale gave them to you." He said nothing. "Then they were scared when they came. Confused. Vernon said their parents had abandoned them, that they needed structure." "They were stolen," Elaine said, "and you knew it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't ask questions. I told myself I was helping." "Where are they now?" she demanded. "Where are my sons?" Howard looked up at her, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "I can take you to one of them." They followed him in silence to a smaller house behind the greenhouse, more private, well-kept. Wind chimes clinketed in the doorway. Inside was a man in his 30s, dark curly hair, warm brown skin, muscular frame. He stood over a stove, stirring something in a pan. When he turned, Elaine's knees buckled. His eyes, his smile. It was Daniel. He looked exactly like her husband, exactly like himself at 7, but grown. "Mom," he whispered. Elaine stepped forward. Trembling Denny, he looked to Howard, then back to her. "I don't remember," he said. I was told you died, that you were in jail." Elaine choked on a sob. Nolan moved quietly toward the door, giving them space. Leia placed a hand on Howard's shoulder. "You took them in," she said, "but you never told them the truth." "I didn't know how," Howard whispered. And then too much time had passed. Daniel, who had been going by Ferdinand, sat with them under the porch awning. He explained everything. "I remember the house," he said. "Broken Elm and Brutus, but I thought it was a dream. We were told we were immigrants, that we had been rescued." Elaine nodded slowly. After Miles, he stopped, throat tight. "We left Vernon's trailer, came here," Nolan asked gently. "Do you know where Evan is?" Daniel nodded. "He's still on the property. We work different sides of the program, but there's more." He hesitated. "There's a third brother." Marco Ella's brow furrowed. "Marco, we're triplets, but we were told he was one of us, that he was the brother. I didn't question it. He looks like us." Nolan stood abruptly. "How many young men here look like you?" Daniel answered softly. 3. Within an hour, Nolan and local law enforcement had detained Howard Fielding and locked down the property. Evan, going by Diego, was found in the main office. He froze when he saw Elaine, but collapsed into her arms as soon as she spoke his name. "I remember your voice," he whispered. They found Marco at a private cabin nearby, watching over a group of younger boys in the garden. He was confused, disoriented, but he looked just like the others. Elaine knew him instantly. Miles' smaller eyes, Daniel's dimples, Evan's gait. "Gabriel," she said. "Your real name is Gabriel." In the barn, they found the Cadillac, still parked, still clean. In the glove compartment, 3 forged birth certificates, a notebook, and a photo Elaine had never seen before. The triplets no older than 10, sitting by a riverbank, fishing rods in hand. No smiles, just stares, hollow and still. They had been missing from the world, but now they were found. Elaine watched the 3 young men from the motel window, Daniel, Evan, Gabriel. They sat on a bench in silence, shoulder to shoulder, sipping soda cans from the vending machine. No one spoke. Occasionally, one would glance at the others, but they didn't make eye contact for long. It was as though some invisible thread bound them together, but so much time had passed that none of them knew how to hold it. She placed her palm on the window. She didn't cry. Not yet. Detective Nolan briefed Elaine and Leia that morning. "Howard Fielding is in custody. He's confessed to harboring the boys since 1990. Claims Vernon Hale brought them to him after things went wrong at the trailer. He said he was trying to save them from further harm." Leia scoffed. "He built a lie around them." "More than that," Nolan said grimly. "He rebuilt their identities. All 3 boys had been issued falsified birth certificates under different names: Ferdinand, Diego, and Gabriel. Daniel had the oldest alias. Miles's replacement, Gabriel, had been adopted from another. Foster child Vernon had briefly taken in before his death. There was no legal record of the child ever existing after 1991. Elaine's voice cracked. "So, they replaced my son?" Nolan nodded. "It appears Gabriel was too young to remember much, but he grew up with the others. He doesn't know who he is, or who." "He isn't," Elaine murmured. A forensic team returned to the old trailer in Arizona. The discovery of Miles's grave led to a wider excavation around the area. Soil samples, partial remains, bones, long decayed. By the end of the week, they had recovered items clearly belonging to other children. A shoelace bracelet, a melted action figure, a small denim jacket with the name Nico embroidered in the tag. "This goes deeper than your boys," Nolan told Elaine. "We believe there were others, not taken together, but hidden the same way, abandoned, swapped, rewritten." Elaine sat back in her chair. "How many?" "We don't know yet, but they would." Elaine met with Gabriel alone the next morning. They sat in a park near the motel under a pecan tree. She brought him lemonade. He barely sipped it. "I don't know what you want from me," he said softly. Elaine looked at him, her voice calm. "I want nothing you don't want to give." He stared at the grass. "They say I'm not Miles, but I look like them. I feel like I belong to them. Doesn't that make it true?" She reached into her purse and took out the 3 bracelets. She set them gently on the bench between them. "These were theirs," she said. "I found them in a box hidden under a floor in a room no one knew existed." Gabriel looked down at the bracelets. Small, colorful, innocent. "I wore one like that," he said. "It said Gabe." Elaine nodded. "That's your name now, but it wasn't always." He didn't speak for a long time. "Then can I keep them?" She nodded. "Keep all 3. Daniel sat with Leia that evening in the motel lobby. He had asked for her. Not his mother. Not yet. "I need to understand something," he said. "Were we famous?" Leia hesitated. "You were remembered?" "That's not the same number. It's not But your faces were in papers on milk cartons. For years, Daniel exhaled, and no one ever found us. You were hidden carefully. You were given new names, new birthdays, new parents, people who buried you inside. A new story. Daniel looked up. So, who am I now? She gave the only answer that felt honest. Who do you want to be? He thought about it for a long time, then said, Daniel. Evan found Elaine in the motel courtyard. She was watering a planter filled with dying flowers. Old habits. I remember your laugh, he said. It used to shake the kitchen. Elaine turned slowly. And I remember yours, she said. It always came. After Daniel like an echo. He nodded. I didn't forget you. I never stopped looking for you. They stood in silence, not needing more. She handed him the watering can. He took it. Gabriel underwent a voluntary DNA test. The results came back. No biological relation to the Cooper family. The news fractured him. I don't know who I am, he whispered to Nolan. I was Miles. Now I'm no one. Elaine stepped in quietly. Number, you were loved by Daniel and Evan. You were raised as a brother. That makes you mine in every way that counts, he cried for the first time. She didn't stop him. The forensic team released their full report on Vernon Hale's and Howard Fielding's activities. At least 5 sets of unidentified child remains across 2 locations, a documented network of forged paperwork and relocation, possibly extending to other states. Mason's journals confirmed at least 3 other transfers whose identities were never known. Fielding pled guilty to conspiracy, unlawful detainment of minors, and obstruction of justice. He would likely die in prison. Elaine did not attend. The sentencing. Let him fade, she said. Let him rot nameless. 1 month later, Daniel, Evan, and Gabriel moved into a rented house near Rosewood. Together, they didn't speak much about the past. Not yet. But Elaine visited every Sunday. She brought food, sometimes photos, sometimes silence. All were accepted. Gabriel started going by his birth name again. Nico Nolan found a long-lost birth certificate buried in the Texas foster system. He had been placed with Vernon Holly briefly as a toddler, then vanished. Now he was real again. Elaine stood once more in her garden, digging into the soil with gloved hands. She planted lilies, 3 of them. For Daniel, for Evan, for Miles. Nico stood beside her, holding the watering can. I think I want to be a teacher, he said. She looked up, surprised. He smiled. I want to help kids feel safe like I never did. Elaine nodded. That would be the best thing you could do. And together they watered the roots. The last time Elaine had flown, it had been for a funeral. This time the plane lifted into a golden sky as she sat between Leia and Detective Nolan, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of water, her fingers trembling only slightly. They weren't returning to Rosewood just yet. Arizona still held one more name, one more loose thread, and Nolan refused to leave it dangling. Ralph Mason. While Howard Fielding had cooperated fully in exchange for a lighter sentence, he'd admitted only vague details about Mason's final movements. He left after Vernon died, took 1 boy with him, the quiet one. I assumed he was Daniel, but I never saw him again. The records traced Mason to a P.O. box in northern Arizona. For a long time, it went cold until a recent property transaction surfaced under one of Mason's old aliases, Harold Moss, a 20-acre compound outside a ghost town called Bitter Ridge. Remote, unregistered, fenced. Nolan called it a last known shadow. They drove through empty highways and sun-bleached rock formations. The further they went, the less the GPS could help them. Cell service dropped. The road narrowed to dirt. "Maybe it's just an old shack," Leia said from the passenger seat. "A dead lead." Elaine said nothing. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. When they reached the compound, it was nearly dusk. It looked untouched, like time had abandoned it. A rusted trailer, a small barn, a satellite dish hanging by a thread, and one man sitting on the porch, legs stretched out, hands resting on his knees. He stood when the car approached, thin, gray-bearded, eyes like steel marbles. Nolan stepped out first. "Ralph Mason," the man didn't flinch. "Depends who's asking." "I'm Detective Sarah Nolan. This is Elaine Cooper." He looked at Elaine, his jaw twitched. "Cooper," he said quietly. Elaine stepped forward. "You knew my sons," she said. He didn't deny it. "I knew a lot of boys," he said. "Some louder than others." They sat around a scarred wooden table inside the trailer. The air smelled of dust, tobacco, and old metal. A fan oscillated in the corner, but did little to fight the heat. "I didn't hurt them," Mason said flatly. "That was Hale. I just kept them alive." Elaine's hands clenched. "You kidnapped them?" "I protected them from a worse fate." "You hid them from their mother." He looked at her. "And what would you have done if you knew the truth? How would the world have treated 3 boys who forgot how to talk, who didn't know their last name anymore?" Elaine's voice didn't rise. "I would have tried," she said. "I would have loved them." Mason looked away. Nolan slid a photo across the table, a still from the youth compound. Daniel and Evan sitting side by side. "This one," she said. "You took him? You took Evan?" Mason's lip twitched. "He wouldn't stop screaming," he said. "Even after Miles died. Hale told me to silence him, but I ran. I took him. Tried to give him a new lifey, gave him a lie," Elaine said. Mason turned to her. "And still, he's alive." In the barn, they found records, names, dates, false documents, but more importantly, they found a box of drawings. Crayon scrolls on aged paper, a dog, "How's a boy with a balloon?" all signed. "E. Cooper, age 9. Elaine pressed them to her chest like scripture. "Why keep these?" Leia asked Mason later. "I had to remember something," he said. "Not everything I did was evil." Nolan stood. "You're going to be charged," she said. "Accessory to kidnapping, unlawful detainment, obstruction." Mason nodded. "I figured. Why didn't you run?" she asked. He looked out the window. "I already did. 30 years ago. Been waiting for the knock ever since." Elaine returned to the motel with Nolan. "And Leia?" She laid the drawings out on the bed. Evan arrived shortly after. He had insisted on coming, wanted to see for himself what Mason had kept. He stepped into the room, saw the drawings, and froze. His hand went to his mouth. "I did these," he whispered. "I remember the dog. I named him Spanner." Elaine took his hand. "You were never forgotten," she said. "Not even by the ones who didn't deserve to remember you." Evan pulled her into a hug. This time, she let the tears fall. The next morning, the 4 of them sat outside the motel, sipping bad coffee and watching the sunrise. Nolan spoke first. "There's one more grave near the trailer. Bones are still being tested." Elaine didn't flinch. "I'm prepared for what we find," she said. "But I know who I have now," Leia added gently. "And you're not alone in this anymore." Nico arrived an hour later, having driven all night from Rosewood. Daniel, too. The triplets, though now different, sat together for the first time in full understanding of who they were and who they weren't. "I don't remember everything," Daniel said. "You don't have to," Elaine replied. "What matters is that you're here." The garden on Broken Elm Street was alive again. Elaine knelt in the dirt as dawn stretched light across the lawn. The lies she had planted weeks ago were starting to bloom, their white petals rising through soft soil like delicate trumpets. Between them she had added violets for courage and lavender for memory. The house across the street, the Ramirez home, now held no secrets. The sealed walls were gone, the hidden relics removed. The garage had been renovated and opened to light for the first time in decades. But it was Elaine's home that now carried the real story, not of horror, but of return. Inside, 3 chairs waited at the breakfast table. Daniel was the first to arrive. He knocked once, then let himself in. Something Elaine had insisted on. His eyes were clear today, his posture stronger. "Morning?" he said, placing a grocery bag on the counter. "I brought the good coffee." Elaine smiled. "Only took you 35 years to learn my taste." Evan came next, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He wore a hoodie with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, a habit he'd had since childhood. Elaine could still picture him crawling under the kitchen table as a boy, looking for cookie crumbs. Nico followed quietly, still soft-spoken, still uncertain, but slowly learning he didn't need a past to earn a future. Elaine poured coffee. They, sat. No one spoke right away, not out of discomfort, but because the silence no longer meant loss. It meant presence. That afternoon, the 4 of them walked to the cemetery outside Rosewood. A new headstone had been placed beside Ella's late husband's grave. Miles Cooper, 1981 to 1990. Our quiet light, still shining. Daniel knelt beside it, a hand on the stone. "He didn't get to grow up," he said. "Not like us." "No," Elaine said, "but he made sure you did." Evan placed a folded drawing beside the grave, one of the crayon sketches recovered from Mason's trailer. It showed 3 boys and a dog under a crooked sun. One boy had wings. "He's always been with us," Evan whispered. Nico took a flower from the bouquet and tucked it behind the stone. No one cried. They simply stood remembering. Later, back at Elaine's house, Leia joined them for dinner. The table was full. Roasted chicken, cornbread, salad, peach cobbler. Elaine insisted on cooking it all herself. "I don't know what to say," Daniel admitted as they sat. "Say you'll come back next Sunday," Elaine said. Evan smirked. "She's serious. She already planned the menu." Laughter bloomed. Even Nico smiled. Later, after dinner, they sat on the porch. Elaine in her rocker, the boys side by side on the steps. The cicadas hummed. The sky stretched wide. "There's something about this house," Nico said. "Even though it's not where we lived, it feels like home." Elaine looked at them all. "It's because you're finally here." Before bed, Elaine walked out into the garden one last time. She knelt and touched the soil beneath the lies. It felt warm, alive. She took 3 smooth stones from her pocket and placed one at the base of each flower. Daniel, Evan, Miles. She paused, then added a 4th. Nico. The night was silent around her, but in her chest, something bloomed. Not grief, not pain, but peace. A quiet strength that had waited 35 years to return. Elaine Cooper had not set foot on Broken Elm Street. In 34 years? Not since the day her 3 sons, triplets, all of 8 years old, vanished somewhere between their school bus stop and the cracked sidewalk outside their home. Not since the town fell silent around her, avoiding eye contact and questions they had no answers for. Not since the prayers dried up and the casserole stopped coming. She told herself year after year that if the truth were buried anywhere, it was buried deep. But when a young couple renovating a house 2 doors down unearthed a rusted red lunchbox with the name Evan scratched into the lid, time collapsed like a shutter snapping shut, and suddenly she wasn't a grieving mother anymore. She was a witness, and someone somewhere had always known the truth.